just engage you in a moment to worship right now. God, we just ask that you be exalted in the praises of your people. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's worship. thank you for victory in Jesus' name. Every testimony that goes forth in this room, that proves your faithfulness through generations. May we see the Lord forever. In Jesus' name, be exalted. Amen. Between John Adams and Jimmy Carter that sound very stands for before Christ. And then it's kind of interesting when it says it stands for before Christ. The idea is that Christ was born in the 1 BC, was the year before that. 2 BC. He was probably born in 2 BC. For a lot of people thought he was born in 4 BC. But anyway, so all this stuff is pretty approximate. But we just need to kind of know what's going on here. And then AD is Latin, stands for Anno Domini, and it would be translated into the English the year of our Lord, the year after Christ was born. Now, here's the strange, two things about it. Nowadays, if you're reading things that give these kind of dates, often you'll see, instead of BC and AD, you'll see BCE, and you'll see CE. And obviously, that's for people who secular want to try to cut Christ out of it. It stands for before common era and common era, but it's still based on the idea of when Christ was born. So I didn't exactly get around cutting them out of things. And here's the thing about a timeline in BC and AD, and most of you already know this, but once again, I don't make any assumptions. I say Christ was born here. BC, the bigger the number, the longer ago it was. AD, the bigger the number, the closer it is, the more recent it is. So if something happened in 1000 BC, then that was about 3,000 years ago. But if something happened in 2000 BC, that's like 4,000 years ago. So once again, I don't want to bore you with anything, but I just want to be sure everybody understands that we're on that page. Last week we talked about Moses, and like I said, there's history. We serve the only God who called the people, brought them out of bondage without the help of an army or anything, and created a nation out of them. He's the only God who's ever done anything like that, to reveal himself to mankind. And when Moses led the Exodus, there's disagreement about that. There's an early date, which would be around 1400, 1450 BC. There's a later date that would be like 1270 BC. There's disagreement about that. I'm not going to go into what the arguments are for either way. I just want to mention it because as you read things, it might get confusing if you don't know, well, there's some disagreement here about this. We're going to go with the earlier date because I think it's the one that has the strongest biblical support for it, around 1450 BC. And Moses did not enter Canaan. Does anybody know why Moses didn't enter The second time he comes, he will be struck. He begins striking. Okay? And so Moses gets frustrated with these people, and he says, you rebels, am I going to have to bring water forth from this rock for you? And instead of turning around and speaking to it, he took his staff and he hit it. And nothing happened. And that's what I would love to do with him, was to see the look on Moses' face. And he went, whoa. And he hit it again, and it finally came forth, and I can just see God kind of like, yeah. And I give the people water. You really messed that up. Not what you did. But anyway, I didn't mean to go there at all. He didn't get to go into Canaan. Joshua led the people into Canaan. And so the first book in the histories is Joshua. And Joshua led the conquest of Canaan. Joshua took the battle of Jericho. All those stories are in there. And he spoke to the sun and the moon and caused them to stand still for almost the length of a day. How does that happen? I don't know. But I believe it happened. And so that's all there in Joshua. We're not going to spend much time there, though. After Joshua passed, actually over in Judges, chapter 2, verse 7, it starts out with this way. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua, and the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. But after that generation passed away, guess what? They began to wander. They began to fall away from God. They're just human beings. That's what we are. Well, people are people. And there are seasons that happen. Happens to us individually, happens to us collectively. There will be seasons, and not every season is forward. Hopefully, the seasons that aren't there are not back. Hopefully, they're just seasons of buoyancy. But with Israel, it was back. And so this issued in about over 300-year period where Israel was ruled by judges. The first one of these judges was a guy named Othniel. He was also the son-in-law of Caleb. He was one of the two spies who would come back and said, we can take the land. But got outvoted. Does anybody know who any of the other judges were? I don't know, some of you do. Samuel was the last one. Yeah. Samson, yeah. Have we run out of ones that we know? Gideon, Deborah, yeah, okay. Probably the three most famous ones would be Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. Deborah came before these other guys. Now, understand, the judge did not rule over all of Israel. The judge there would be specific tribes, portions of Israel. It wasn't really a nation yet. It was just kind of a confederacy of these different tribes. And the judges would be over specific tribes. And in Deborah's case, I really like this story. First of all, because she's a woman, right? And so when they got in trouble, I think Jabin was the name of the king. Sisera was his commander who was harassing them and causing them all kinds of trouble. And so they go to Deborah for help. And she calls on this guy named Barak. How many of you knew that our 44th president had a biblical name? Yeah. Named Barak. And Barak comes and she says, go and defeat Sisera. The Lord is going to be with you and he's going to give you the victory. And Barak said, yeah, I'll go if you go with me. Mommy. She wasn't his mommy, but he was kind of acting that way. And she said, well, because you're acting this way, you're going to get the victory, but you're not going to get the credit for killing on in here. I'll let you rest in here. And she gave him some milk and laid him down, and he went to sleep. And she took a hammer and a spike and put his head not his head to the carpet, if they had carpet. Like I say, it's some pretty grisly stuff. Gideon, that would be the next famous one that came along. And of course, a lot of you know that I went through the story of Gideon, but Gideon was not a brave man. You know, God does not necessarily call those who seem to be best qualified. In fact, he was hiding in a wine press, threshing wheat. How many of you have ever threshed wheat before? I haven't either. And I've also never stood in a wine press. But I can kind of imagine that it's probably not the best place to do it. Because I think what you do is you throw the wheat up in the air, and the wind is supposed to blow the chaff away and keep the wheat. And a hole in the ground is not the best place to fetch the wind. And the Lord comes to him and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." And Gideon says, "Well, if the Lord is with us, what about being down in this wine press threshing wheat?" But the Lord called him, and the Lord held his hand, and the Lord brought him along. And as you know, finally gave him an army of 300 people to defeat an army as numerous as the sands on the seashore. And then there's Samson. Oh, God love him. When I was teaching others about it, I remember we were going through this, and I got to talking about Samson, and I asked the students, how would you like to have Samson as your pastor? And they were all kind of like, ha, ha, ha. I think we got some Samsons these days. He was a little worldly, to say the least. Ended up being done in by a prostitute that he was visiting on a regular basis. And yet, God used him. God used him. God called him. I remember back in the 70s, there was a book came out about a lady named Catherine Kuhlman. And some of you would know who Catherine Kuhlman are, but a lot of you probably wouldn't. And it was kind of a biography of her. And I bought it, and the guy at the bookstore said, "You know what I learned from this book?" I said, "Oh, what?" He said, "I learned God uses cracked pots." God uses cracked pots. Samson was definitely one. David was definitely one. Catherine Kuhlman was definitely one. You're one, so am I. But God uses us. And so Judges goes on. The last story in Judges, which I won't get into, kind of makes Sodom and Gomorrah look like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. But like I say, pretty grisly period, and there is a recurring theme that comes out of Judges, and it's this. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit in their own eyes. Well, as I mentioned, Samuel was the last of Israel's judges. And his sons did not follow in his footsteps. And so the people came along and said, "Give us a king. We want a king to rule over us so we'll be like the other nations." And Samuel gives them a king. And the stories of all this begins in 1 Samuel. And the first king that he gives them was Solomon. No, I'm sorry, Saul. Somebody was going to correct me, right? We weren't going to let me go on with that. Was Saul. Saul started out pretty well. I mean, he was a humble guy. Couldn't hardly believe that he was going to be king. But what got him was his fear. He lost, first of all, his dynasty because he was afraid of the enemy. And I think I mentioned it last week, or maybe it was in Sunday school Sunday. I don't know. Recently, I have told somebody that, Saul
was supposed to wait for Samuel to come and do the sacrifice. I think it was Sunday morning. Was supposed to wait for Samuel to come and do the sacrifice, but he got afraid because his army was shrinking and the Philistines were growing, and he decided he'd go ahead and do the sacrifice himself. And when Samuel came, he went, what have you done? And Saul goes, well, you didn't come when you said you were going to come. So, because you've done this thing, your dynasty is not going to endure, which means your line is not going to endure. Well, the second fear that he had was of his own people, because Saul was tossed a little softball. He said, go and defeat the Amalekites, completely annihilate them, destroy everything. And he went, and it was an easy victory, but he didn't follow through. He kept the best of the stuff. And when Samuel comes and goes, what have you done now? He said, well, I obeyed what God said. No, hush, wait. You did not obey what God said. Well, I brought this stuff back to sacrifice. To obey is better than sacrifice. Well, why did you do this? Well, the people wanted to keep this stuff, and I was afraid of them. You know, you can't be a leader and be afraid of your own people. And a lot of people who try to be leaders are afraid of their own people. Saul was one of them. And he said, okay, now you're going to lose the kingdom yourself. And then ultimately, the man who came along, David, you know that, Saul became afraid of him. And because of his fear of him, he wasn't able to allow the greatest gift that God had given to Saul's kingdom was David. But it wasn't a great gift because of Saul's fear. One of the things that I think it's really important, it's important in church and church settings, but it's important in everything in life, is when somebody comes along after you who can do it better than you. Well, I know that's hard to believe. But when somebody comes along who can do it better than you, you should rejoice in that. You should be happy about that. Anyway, Saul wasn't, so he reigned for 40 years. He was killed by the Philistines. David then became the next king. His dynasty is established, and we'll get into that in a minute. He reigned for 40 years himself, 7 of them in Hebron and 33 of them in Jerusalem. He did not initially become the king over all Israel when Saul died. Saul had a son named Ishbosheth who was made king over all the tribes of Israel except for Judah. Because David was from Judah, the people of Judah went ahead and made him their king, and there was war between the two. David did not end up killing Ishbosheth. He had some treachery in his own house that ended up killing him. But then David became king over all of Israel. And then his son, Solomon, the guy I tried to make the first king, was the third king, and he reigned for 40 years. These are the only 3 people who reigned over all of Israel. There was only 3 kings who was over all 12 of the tribes. And Solomon starts well. He starts great. He builds the temple, and he's writing Proverbs, and things are going great. But by the end, the wheels come off. And by the end of his reign, he's not really a godly king anymore. I kind of think Solomon's probably going to be in heaven, but it's not my decision. We'll see when we get there. And so the kingdom splits. And some people, a lot of you probably know about this, but some of you probably don't. There were these 2 guys, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And I used to think when I was a little kid that they were brothers because they were named Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And I thought, well, they're the Boam brothers. But they weren't brothers at all. Rehoboam was the son of Solomon. Jeroboam wasn't related to him at all. When Solomon died, Solomon had been very oppressive to the people, especially toward the latter part of his reign. When he died, the people came to Rehoboam and said, hey, lighten up, will you? If you lighten up, then it'll be great, and we'll continue to have you as our king. And Rehoboam went to his counselors, and the wiser counselors said, yeah, if you'll just lighten up a little bit on these people, they'll serve you and everything will go well. And then he went to the young stupid ones. And the young stupid ones said, you go back and you tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. You think my father was hard? I'm going to be even harder. And that's what he decided to do, was he decided to go back and tell them that, and they decided, we don't want you as king. And 10 of the tribes, all of the tribes except for Judah and Benjamin, went with Jeroboam and formed the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom, does anybody know what another name for the northern kingdom is? You can say it out loud. Israel. So from that time on, if you read about a political entity called Israel, we're talking about the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom would be called, does anybody know what that was called? Judah. Yeah. Hence, the name Jews come from that southern kingdom of Judah. Now, when this happens, Jeroboam, he decides, it's not going to be a good idea for the people to keep going to Jerusalem to worship God. Because if they keep going to Jerusalem to worship God, they're going to end up going back to the house of David. And what's going to happen to Jeroboam then? So he decided that he would create 2 other places of worship, one of them in Bethel, one of them in Dan. And guess what he built there? Golden calves. He put a golden calf in Bethel, a golden calf in Dan, and he said, look, it's too far for you to go to Jerusalem. I mean, that's not even convenient. You can worship at these places. And that set Israel off on the wrong track from the get-go. The northern kingdom never had a truly godly king. There's on the back page, one of the things that you got here are the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. And none of the kings of Israel were truly godly. The closest that came to it was a guy named Jehu, but he really wasn't. The worst one was a guy named Ahab. Does anybody know anything about Ahab? Does anybody know his wife's name? Yeah, Jezebel was his wife's name. And Ahab, there's a lot about Ahab in the scriptures. One of the reasons is that there's a lot about him is because of the prophet who interacted with him. See anybody? Yeah, Elijah. So where we read about Elijah is in these histories. In 721 BC, the northern kingdom falls. It is conquered by Assyria. The southern kingdom is still standing, but it's conquered by Assyria. And the people are deported, and there's never a return. Occasionally you'll hear somebody talk about, or you'll hear somebody do some teaching about the lost tribes of Israel. Okay. Well, these are them, I guess, because they never officially came back. Where'd they go? Well, some of them came back. Some of them went other places. Some of them remained faithful to God. Some of them didn't remain faithful to God. That's just how it was. So there's never been an official return. Now, what did happen was when Assyria deported them, they brought other people from conquered lands in to live in the northern kingdom of Israel. And the capital of that northern kingdom was Samaria. And so in the New Testament, these people are known as Samaritans. So when you read about Samaritans in the New Testament, that's who they are. Now, they considered that they worshiped God, but the Jews considered, no, you don't really. You don't go to the right church. You're not part of us. The house of David stays intact and rules over the southern kingdom, except for one period. There was a period of 7 years where they had a queen. Her name was Athaliah, and her son, she was actually from the house of Ahab in the northern kingdom, and she had married into the royal line in the southern kingdom, and her son was the king, and he got killed. And when he got killed, she tried to kill everyone else in the house of David, which she succeeded except for one guy who was a baby, and the nurse had been able to escape with him. His name was Joash, and so 7 years after Athaliah came to the throne, Joash is revealed, and Athaliah is toast. She's highly upset, but it doesn't do her any good. And the godliness of these kings is a mixed bag. There are some standouts. There are a couple of negative standouts. First one was a guy named Ahaz. And Ahaz sought help from Assyria. When things would get tight, when he'd get in trouble, Ahaz, rather than turning to God, he sought help from Assyria. He sent to the king of Assyria and said, come on down and help me. Israel's trying to attack me, and I got these enemies everywhere. And Chronicles says that the king of Assyria came to him, but he gave him trouble instead of help. But nevertheless, he was very subservient to him. He in fact, actually had the priest move the altar that the sacrifices were made on, move it off to the side, because he had this better altar that he had seen in Assyria built. So that was the kind of guy that Ahaz was. Now, he had a very famous prophet during his time as well who advised him. He just didn't listen to anything the guy had to say. That famous prophet was Isaiah. And one of there's an incident where Isaiah comes to the king and says, look, don't worry about what's going on. God's going to take care of you. Ask the Lord for a sign. And Ahaz goes, no, I'm not going to ask the Lord for a sign. I'm not going to test God that way. And the reason that he said that is because he'd already made up his mind what he was going to do, and he had already turned for help elsewhere. And a very famous verse that's important to us was Isaiah's reply to him. It says, well, therefore the Lord's going to give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. You will call him Emmanuel. So Ahaz was where that prophecy comes from. The other really, really bad king they had was a guy named Manasseh. And Manasseh was the son of probably the most righteous king. Isn't it amazing that sometimes you got really great parents and really stinky kids, and sometimes you have really stinky parents and you have really great kids? You just don't know. There are no guarantees. All you can do is all you can do, and put everything else in God's hands. He didn't follow the Lord at all. He did everything he could to lead Israel astray. And the fact that he was 12 years old when he came to the throne probably didn't help much. 2 Chronicles 33:9 says this. It says, Manasseh led Judah and the people of Jerusalem astray, so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites even came in. In fact, it was during his reign that Isaiah was martyred, and the Bible doesn't say this, but according to Jewish tradition, he had Isaiah martyred by sawing him in two with a saw. He was a bad dude. Now, Chronicles also says that in the end he repented and turned to the Lord. So you know what? I think Manasseh's going to be in heaven. But it was too late to do anything for the nation at that point in time. A couple of standouts in terms of the good kings that they had. I'm not going to mention David because you probably already know a lot about David, but Hezekiah. Hezekiah led a great revival. And it's kind of interesting. There were a number of things that happened during Hezekiah's reign that are recorded, but I'll mention two things quickly. One of them, Assyria, the one who had taken Israel into captivity, came, surrounded Jerusalem, looked like Jerusalem was going to fall, and Isaiah sent word to Hezekiah saying, hey, God's got this, don't worry about it. And so Hezekiah said, you know, God's got this, we're not going to do the things that you say. And in one night, God sent one angel and killed 185,000 of the Assyrian troops. And guess what? They went home. They decided that they weren't going, they'd had enough of that. So that happened during Hezekiah's reign. Another thing that happened was Hezekiah got sick, got real sick. Isaiah comes to him and he says, you're going to die, so get your house in order. And Hezekiah turns and prays to God and beseeches him, and, you know, I don't want to die. And, you know, there are worse things that can happen than dying, okay? But, you know, I don't want to die. And so Isaiah comes back to him and says, the Lord's going to add 15 years to your life. So he did. He lived another 15 years. And 3 years into that, Manasseh was born, so that the worst king that Judah ever had came to the throne. Interesting stuff there. The other standout good king would be Josiah. Josiah led a great revival after the damage that his grandfather Manasseh had done. He died young, though. He died at the age of 31, and he was killed in battle. And he had 3 sons who sat on the throne of Israel. It's kind of interesting because nobody else had more than one, but he had 3 that ended up sitting. But none of them were godly. He was the last godly government Israel has had. Go back 2,800 years. That was a lot. I mean, when Jesus came, that wasn't exactly a godly government. And now it's a very secular government. Josiah was the last one. Well, that brings us to Babylon. The southern kingdom of Judah had gotten worse and worse and worse and turned to idolatry and idolatry and idolatry. And when we look at the prophets, we'll get into some of that. But the southern kingdom of Judah fell and was conquered by Babylon. And they deported people to Babylon. Now, the reason why they would do that in those days, they came in and they conquered a land. They would uproot the people and they would take them to some place where they didn't know, kind of to disorient the whole. You know, it's one thing to go into a nation and conquer it and then occupy it. And that doesn't work out very well. It still doesn't work out very well today. So what they would do is go, well, we're going to come and we're going to take this land and you're going to go over there to another place that you don't know. And so they would deport people. Now, Babylon wasn't quite as brutal as Assyria, and they actually had 3 different periods, 3 different times of deportation that they did. Beginning in 605, was it 605, 605, 608, somewhere around there, one of those things. What did I put in here? 607? Yes. Well, that's close to 608 and to 605. So you see what I mean about these dates things. That was the first deportation. And the Jews were in Babylon for almost 70 years. Jeremiah, we'll talk about this when we get into the prophets. Jeremiah prophesied that they would be in captivity for 70 years. You kind of go, well, why weren't they? But because there's really no way you can make the period of time from when they first left to when they were allowed to come back be a 70-year period of time. But over in Daniel, you find Daniel praying a prayer, going, God, it's almost 70 years. Would you do it now? And God answers prayer. He answers prayer. Jesus actually says concerning the end of the tribulation at the end of days, he says, unless those days are cut short, no one's going to survive, but they will be cut short because people are going to be calling out to God. So anyway, they were there for almost 70 years. Ezekiel and Daniel were members of the captives in Babylon. Their ministries took place in Babylon. We'll talk about that. And in 538 BC, again, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and a guy named Cyrus decreed that the Jews could return, and some of them did. Now, remember, when the northern kingdom was deported, there was no official return. Some of them did come back. I mean, they're people. Some of them did come back. Others were scattered. When the Jews were sent to Babylon, there was an official time they could return, but they didn't all just go, oh, yay, let's go back to Jerusalem right now, because Jerusalem was basically a dung heap, and they had it pretty good in Babylon. God had told them, you know, work for the prosperity of the country where you are, and I will prosper you. I know the plans that I have for you, says God. That's what that was all about. And plans to prosper you and to do you good. And so they had life pretty well there. And so really not that many wanted to go back. And so when you talk about the lost tribes of Israel, well, they're all lost. And some of them came back. It's just that simple. And so we want to very quickly run through the third page there, the books of the history. Joshua covers the conquest of Canaan, coming into the land. Judges, the period after Joshua, before a kingdom is established. And then Ruth, it's a sweet story during the period of the Judges involving David's grandparents. It's a rom-com involving Ruth and Boaz and some other characters there. And it's really nice. And then 1 Samuel starts with Samuel's birth and covers through the death of Saul. 2 Samuel is basically the reign of King David. And then Kings, from Solomon to the deportation of Babylon. And now Kings focuses, you say, well, Kings and Chronicles cover the same stuff, don't they? Well, they cover the same period of time, but they don't cover the same stuff necessarily. Kings is a lot more focused on the northern kingdom, Israel. Chronicles is a lot more focused on Judah, the southern kingdom. Chronicles is a lot more focused on the worship of the Lord and the things that went into that. Kings covers the ministries of Elijah and Elisha. I kind of think of Kings as sort of a newspaper account. It's sort of like, you know, this is what's happening today. Chronicles, on the other hand, is really more of God's perspective. And that's one of the reasons why it focuses more on Judah than it does on the northern kingdom. And oftentimes in Chronicles, you'll hear not only this is what happened, but you'll hear this is why it happened. It was because of the unfaithfulness of the people that this happened, or it was because of the repentance of the people that this happened. It's God's perspective. And by the way, let me just throw this out. After the Jews came back from Babylon, the ones who did come back from Babylon, idolatry was never an issue again. I mean, God had to do some really radical stuff to take care of it, but He did take care of it. Ezra led one of the returns, the initial return of the Jews to Jerusalem, and the political challenges that were faced by them as they tried to restore worship in Jerusalem. And Ezra is chronologically, the most mixed up book in the Bible. I mean, you might think, oh, well, chapter 5 follows chapter 4, but no, chapter 5 might have happened 40 years before chapter 4, and it just gets worse as you go on. But it's worth reading. It really is. Just don't get too hung up on what happened when. Nehemiah covers Nehemiah being appointed governor in Judah and rebuilding the walls and the religious reforms that he instituted. And then there's Esther. Many of you know that story of a Jewish girl becomes the queen of Persia. This was after the return, obviously. She was not one of the ones that returned, and her uncle Mordecai was obviously not one of the ones that returned. So anyway, I hope some of this is helpful. As you read the Old Testament, I think sometimes if you just go in with a blank slate, it's just kind of like, oh, well, there was Israel, and there was always, no, the kingdom split. There were different deportations. They didn't always have a king and other things. And so if you kind of have a little bit of a grasp of that going in, then hopefully it's more interesting. Does anybody want to add anything or have a question? Okay. Say what now? Yeah. There is a Bible that is, I think it's called the chronological Bible, that you can get, that they take the books and try and put the information in chronological order. I don't have a copy, but maybe some of you do, and I'm sure it's possible to get a hold of one. Yeah. Yes, Gene? Okay, you're going to have to speak up a little bit louder. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It would have been approximately 1,000 years before